Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Mango Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. Brian sat at the edge of the couch, his eyes fixed on the delicate swirl of steam rising from his untouched cup of coffee. Across from him, Samantha paced the room, her arms folded tightly across her chest. The ticking of the clock seemed louder in the silence, each second stretching unbearably. "I'm only asking for one night, Brian," Samantha said, her voice a mixture of frustration and desperation. "I just need to talk to him, to put the past behind me." Brian's jaw tightened. He had always prided himself on being a calm and rational man, but this request tested the limits of his patience. "It's not like he's been a part of your life all these years. Why now? Why him?" Samantha stopped pacing and faced him, her brown eyes pleading. "Because I can't move forward with this until I let go of him completely. It's closure, Brian. That's all it is." Brian wanted to argue, to tell her how absurd it sounded, but he couldn't find the words. Samantha had always been honest with him, or so he believed. If this was something she genuinely needed, who was he to stand in her way? "Fine," he said at last, his voice steady but cold. "One night. But don't expect me to be waiting when you get back." Samantha flinched at his tone, but nodded. "Thank you. I'll call when I'm on my way home." Brian didn't respond, watching silently as she grabbed her purse and headed out the door. The sound of her car pulling out of the driveway echoed in the quiet house, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the blank television screen, the glow of the clock casting faint shadows across the room. Then, with deliberate precision, he reached for his phone and opened the Notes app. Mark was exactly as Brian imagined: charismatic, confident, and entirely too aware of his effect on women. He and Samantha met at a dimly lit restaurant downtown, the kind of place where intimacy hung in the air like perfume. Samantha fiddled with her napkin, her mind racing as she searched for the right words to start this conversation. It had been years since she'd seen Mark, and yet he seemed unchanged. He smiled at her, that same charming smile that had once made her knees weak. "You look good, Sam," he said, leaning back in his chair with a casual ease. Thanks," she replied, forcing a polite smile. "You too." They made small talk, their words skimming the surface of deeper, unspoken questions. Samantha couldn't help but notice how easily Mark slipped into their old dynamic, his voice smooth and persuasive. But as the evening wore on, the memory of their past began to blur against the reality of who they had become. Samantha saw through the charm, recognizing the manipulation she had once mistaken for love. Meanwhile, back home, Brian was anything but idle. He had made up his mind the moment Samantha walked out the door. Trust was a fragile thing, and her willingness to reopen this chapter of her life left him questioning everything. He packed quickly and efficiently, his movements methodical. Clothes, essentials, important documents, all of it disappeared into suitcases and storage boxes. Brian worked late into the night, the weight of his decision steadying him as he emptied their shared life piece by piece. By the time Samantha returned home, the house was eerily quiet. She stepped inside, expecting to find Brian waiting in the living room, but instead she was greeted by an emptiness that made her stomach drop. On the kitchen counter, sat a single piece of paper. She picked it up with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the neat handwriting. You wanted one night, now you've got a lifetime. Her knees buckled, the note slipping from her grasp. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Brian was gone, and this time there would be no second chances. Brian drove through the night, the weight of the past lifting with each mile. He didn't look back, his focus set on the future. A future where betrayal had no place. As the first rays of dawn broke across the horizon, he felt a sense of liberation he hadn't known was possible. For Samantha, the night had begun with questions about her past, but ended with a stark lesson about her present. The cost of closure had been far higher than she ever imagined. Samantha sat motionless in the empty living room, Brian's note trembling in her hand. The silence in the house pressed in on her, a physical weight she hadn't noticed before. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for some sign of him. His wallet on the counter, his keys on the hook by the door, but there was nothing. It was as if Brian had evaporated, taking their life together with him. Her first instinct was to call him, to explain, to beg him to come home. She fumbled for her phone, but as her fingers hovered over his name and her contacts, she hesitated. What could she possibly say? That she had made a mistake? That she didn't mean for things to spiral this way? The truth was, Samantha didn't even know what she had been looking for when she met Mark that night. Her chest tightened as she remembered their conversation. Mark had leaned across the table, his voice low and intimate. "You really never stopped thinking about me, did you?" Samantha had bristled at the arrogance in his tone, but she forced a laugh. "Don't flatter yourself. I just needed to put the past to rest." Mark's smile faltered for a moment before he recovered, his gaze narrowing. "Is that what you told yourself? Come on, Sam. You wouldn't be here if you were really happy with your husband." Oh, the words stung, but Samantha pushed back. "I love Brian. This isn't about him. It's about me needing clarity, and now I have it." Mark had chuckled, shaking his head. "You always were good at lying to yourself, but fine, if that's what you want to believe." The rest of the evening passed in awkward, stilted conversation. Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that she had stepped into a trap of her own making. Now, sitting alone in a hollowed-out house, she realized just how much she had risked. The thought struck her suddenly. What if he's really gone? Samantha bolted to her feet, her mind racing. She checked the bedroom first, then the closet, then the garage. Everywhere she looked, she was met with the same unnerving emptiness. Even his toothbrush was gone. Panic bubbled in her chest, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She grabbed her phone again, scrolling through her contacts. Maybe one of Brian's friends knew where he was. But then the deeper fear began to creep in. What if they knew? Her thumb hovered over his best friend Jason's name, but she couldn't bring herself to dial. What if Brian had already told him everything? What if Jason answered with coldness, or worse, pity? Instead, Samantha typed out a frantic text to Brian. "Please come home. We need to talk." She hit send and stared at the screen, waiting. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The silence stretched into the early morning, and still There was no reply. For Brian, the drive had been strangely cathartic. He had stopped once at a gas station on the highway, grabbing a coffee and taking a moment to stretch his legs. He looked at his phone, saw Samantha's text, and turned the screen off without reading it. He had spent years being the steady one in their marriage, the calm voice in every argument, the anchor that kept them grounded. But Samantha's decision to meet with Mark had shattered something fundamental in him. Trust wasn't just something that could be repaired with words. It was something that had to be protected, nurtured. She had thrown it away for the chance to relive a past that no longer existed. Brian had no intention of playing the fool. As the miles stretched behind him, he began to feel a sense of relief. He wasn't running away. He was starting fresh. Back at the house, Samantha finally slumped onto the couch, exhausted and defeated. Her mind replayed every conversation, every moment leading up to that fateful night. She had told herself that meeting Mark would bring her clarity, but all it had done was unearth doubts she hadn't even realized she had. Had she been lying to herself about her love for Brian? Or had Mark's manipulative charm planted seeds of insecurity that didn't belong there? Samantha didn't know anymore, and that terrified her. By mid-morning, she knew she couldn't stay in the house any longer. Every corner of it felt like a rebuke, a reminder of what she had lost. She grabbed her coat and headed out, unsure of where she was going, but desperate to escape the suffocating emptiness. As she drove aimlessly through the city, Samantha's phone buzzed with a text notification. Her heart leapt as she grabbed it, hoping against hope that it was Brian. But the message wasn't from him. It was from Mark. Had a great time last night. Hope you found the closure you were looking for. Samantha stared at the message, her stomach twisting in knots. Whatever she had hoped to gain from last night, this wasn't it. And now, it seemed, she had lost far more than she could ever recover. Samantha sat behind the wheel of her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Mark's text lingered on her phone screen, mocking her with its casual arrogance. She thought about responding, telling him to stay out of her life, but what would be the point? None of this was his fault. Not until the world's biggest bankruptcy. She threw the phone onto the passenger seat and leaned back, staring through the windshield. It wasn't just the weight of what she had done that pressed down on her. It was the enormity of what she had lost. Brian's absence wasn't just physical. It felt like a piece of her identity had been ripped away. Her car idled in a grocery store parking lot, surrounded by the bustle of ordinary people going about their lives. The normalcy only deepened her sense of isolation. She had no idea what to do next. Going home felt unbearable, but staying here in limbo wasn't an option either. Her thoughts turned to her sister, Laura. Maybe she could provide some clarity, or at least a distraction. Samantha fumbled for her phone again and called her. "Sam?" Laura answered after a few rings, her voice warm but wary. "What's up? You sound off? Can I come over?" Samantha's voice cracked, betraying her attempt to sound composed. "Of course. Are you okay?" "No," Samantha admitted softly. "Not even a little." When Laura opened the door, her sharp eyes immediately took in Samantha's disheveled state. She ushered her inside, offering a mug of tea and a seat at the kitchen table. "Start talking," Laura said, her tone a mix of concern and no-nonsense authority. Samantha hesitated, running her fingers along the edge of the mug. "Brian left," she said finally. Laura's eyebrows shot up. "Left? As in, for good? Or for this country to crumble into ashes with you in it?" "I don't know, I came home last night and he was gone. The house was empty. He took everything." Samantha's voice cracked again, and tears began to spill down her cheeks. Laura handed her a tissue. "What happened? Why would he just leave like that?" Samantha hesitated again, then admitted, "I met up with Mark." The name landed like a stone between them, and Laura leaned back, crossing her arms. "You mean the Mark? The ex who practically wrote the book on being a selfish jerk. What were you thinking?" I wasn't," Samantha admitted. I thought it would give me closure, help me move on. But now I've lost Brian, and I don't even know if I can fix this." "Closure?" Laura's voice rose. Sam, closure isn't something you get from someone else. It's something you find within yourself. What did you think Mark was going to do? Apologize and magically erase all your doubts? He's the same manipulative guy he's always been." Samantha flinched at the harsh truth in her sister's words. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered. "No one ever does," Laura said, softening her tone. "But now you have to figure out how to deal with the fallout. Have you tried talking to Brian?" "I texted him, but he didn't respond." Laura sighed. "Then you need to give him time. He probably feels betrayed, Sam, and honestly, I don't blame him." Meanwhile, Brian was settling into a small rental house on the outskirts of the city. The place was modest but clean, with just enough space to hold the essentials he had taken from the home he once shared with Samantha. He stood in the living room, staring at the boxes stacked against the walls. Everything here represented a fresh start, but instead of feeling liberated, he felt hollow. Brian had always been the kind of man who avoided confrontation. He believed in fixing problems through communication and compromise. But Samantha's decision to meet with Mark had shattered his sense of stability. His phone buzzed on the counter, breaking his train of thought. He picked it up, expecting another message from Samantha, but it was Jason, his best friend. "How's the new place?" Jason asked when Brian answered. "It's fine. And you?" Brian hesitated. "I don't know, man. Part of me feels like I made the right decision, but part of me wonders if I acted too fast. What if I threw away a marriage that could have been saved?" Jason's voice grew firm. "Brian, don't do that to yourself. You didn't throw anything away. She did. You gave her everything, your trust, your support, and she went looking for something else. That's not on you." Brian leaned against the counter, Jason's words sinking in. "I just didn't think she was capable of this. I feel like I've been living with a stranger." "People change," Jason said. "Sometimes for the better, sometimes not. The question is, can you trust her again? And if not, what's the point of trying?" Brian didn't respond immediately. The truth was, he didn't know the answer. As the days passed, Samantha tried to reach Brian multiple times, but each message went unanswered. She drove past his office, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, but his car wasn't there. Her desperation grew with each passing day. She thought about going to Jason, asking if he knew where Brian was, but she couldn't bring herself to face the judgment in his eyes. Finally, she decided to write him a letter. It was the only way she could pour out her feelings without interruption. She wrote about how much she regretted meeting Mark, how it had shown her that the past didn't matter nearly as much as the present. But as she sealed the envelope and prepared to mail it, a nagging doubt crept in. Would he even read it? Or had she already lost the only man who had ever truly loved her? Samantha stared at the letter for a long time, her heart heavy with the realization that some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. The envelope with Samantha's letter lay on the dining table, unopened. Brian had found it slipped under his door early that morning. He'd recognized her handwriting instantly, and the weight of it in his hands felt heavier than paper should. But he hadn't opened it. Not yet. Instead, Brian poured himself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, staring out at the overgrown backyard. The rental house wasn't much, but it offered solitude, something he desperately needed. For days now, he had wrestled with conflicting emotions: anger, sadness, confusion. He didn't miss the house he had left behind as much as he missed the life it had symbolized. A life he thought was built on love and trust. His phone buzzed on the counter. Jason again. "You gonna ignore me forever?" Jason asked when Brian finally answered. "I've been busy," Brian replied, his voice flat. Right. Jason wasn't buying it. Busy staring at the walls and brooding? Brian sighed, rubbing his temples. "What do you want me to say, Jason? That I'm fine? Because I'm not. I don't know if I ever will be. I want you to stop punishing yourself for someone else's mistake," Jason said bluntly. "You walked away because she didn't respect what you built together. That's not on you." It's not that simple." Brian muttered. "It is that simple. The woman lied to you, and for what, closure? That's not how marriage works, man. She didn't just betray your trust. She threw it out the window. Now, you need to figure out what you want." Jason's words hung in the air long after the call ended. Brian knew he was right. The question wasn't about Samantha anymore. It was about him, what he needed, what he deserved. Across town, Samantha sat on her couch, staring at the empty space where Brian's chair used to be. She had mailed the letter 2 days ago, and every moment since had been filled with agonizing uncertainty. She had spent the days cycling between guilt and regret, reliving every choice that had led to this moment. Meeting Mark had been a mistake, but deeper than that was her realization that she hadn't truly appreciated what she had with Brian. Her sister Laura had been brutally honest with her, as always. "What did you expect, Sam? That you could just waltz back home and everything would be fine?" "No," Samantha had replied, her voice trembling. I thought he'd understand." "Understand what? That you needed someone else to remind you what you already had? You broke his trust, Sam, and trust isn't something you can patch up with words." Laura's words stung because they were true. Samantha knew she had taken Brian for granted, believing that his steady love would always be there, no matter what. Now, she wasn't so sure. She checked her phone again, hoping for a response to her texts. Nothing. Desperation gnawed at her. She considered driving to his office, or asking Jason where he was staying. But deep down, she knew that wouldn't help. If Brian wanted to talk to her, he would. For now, all she could do was wait. Brian finally opened the letter late that evening, sitting at the small kitchen table with a glass of whiskey. The neat handwriting was familiar, but the words felt foreign. I left first wearing our own jackets and boots. Samantha had written about regret, about how meeting Mark had made her realize how much she valued their marriage. She admitted to being selfish, to chasing answers she didn't need. But there was one line that stuck with Brian the most. I know I've broken something between us, and I don't know if it can ever be fixed, but I hope you'll give me the chance to try. He set the letter down and stared at it, the words blurring as his emotions churned. Did he want to give her that chance? Could he? Brian thought about their life together, the small, quiet moments that had made up their marriage. Movie nights on the couch, Sunday morning pancakes, the way Samantha laughed when he tried to dance in the kitchen. Those memories were real. They mattered. But they weren't the whole story anymore. Samantha spent the evening pacing her living room, trying to distract herself with old photo albums. Flipping through the pages, she saw snapshots of vacations, anniversaries, and ordinary days that felt like lifetimes ago. Her eyes lingered on a photo of her and Brian at a friend's wedding. They were laughing, their arms around each other, oblivious to the world around them. Tears welled up as she realized how much had changed. She wasn't the same woman in that photo, and Brian wasn't the same man. But did that mean their marriage was beyond saving? The next morning, Brian sat in his car outside the house he used to call home. He hadn't planned on coming back, but something had pulled him here. A need for closure of his own. He didn't go inside. Instead, he sat there staring at the house, remembering the life they had built together. Finally, he pulled out his phone and sent a single text. "We need to talk." Samantha's phone buzzed on the counter. She grabbed it, her heart racing as she read the message. For the first time in days, she allowed herself a glimmer of hope. Brian wasn't sure where the conversation would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. This was the beginning of something new, whether it was reconciliation or the final goodbye. The sun was beginning to set as Samantha anxiously prepared herself. Brian's text, "We need to talk," had set her heart pounding in equal parts relief and apprehension. She spent hours rehearsing what she would say, but the words felt hollow every time she practiced them. When the knock came at the door, she froze. Her legs felt like lead as she walked across the room, her hand trembling as she turned the knob. Brian stood there, his expression calm but unreadable. He looked different, more tired maybe, or perhaps just resolved. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice steady. Samantha nodded and stepped aside, closing the door behind him. She gestured toward the living room, where they sat on opposite ends of the couch, an awkward silence stretching between them. Finally, Samantha spoke. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure if you ever would." Brian exhaled deeply. "I wasn't sure either." Her throat tightened, but she pressed on. I read your note over and over, and I want you to know that I understand why you left. I do. But I need you to know how much I regret what I did. Meeting Mark was a mistake, Brian finished for her. Yes, Samantha said, her voice trembling. It was a mistake. I thought I needed closure. But the truth is, I was chasing something that didn't exist. And in doing that, I betrayed you. I betrayed us. Brian looked down at his hands, his fingers interlocked. He was silent for a moment before responding. Do you even understand why I left? Samantha blinked, taken aback. Because I hurt you. Because I broke your trust. Yes, Brian said, his tone sharp. But it's more than that. It's the fact that you didn't even consider what this would do to me. You didn't think about how it would feel to be the husband sitting at home while his wife went off to meet her ex. It's not just that you made a mistake. It's that you didn't value what we had enough to protect it. His words cut deep, but Samantha nodded. You're right, she said softly. I didn't think it through. I didn't think about how it would hurt you, and that's on me. But, Brian, I never stopped loving you. I love you now, more than ever. Brian's gaze finally met hers, and for the first time she saw the depth of his pain. Love isn't enough, Samantha. Not without trust. And right now, I don't know if I can trust you again. Samantha's chest tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. I know rebuilding trust takes time. But if you're willing to give me the chance, I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I'm still the woman you fell in love with. Brian leaned back, his expression conflicted. The woman I fell in love with wouldn't have done this, Sam. That's the problem. I don't know who you are anymore. Samantha felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. I'm still me, Brian, and I'm still the woman who loves you, who wants to spend the rest of her life making this right. I know I can't undo what I did, but I'm asking for the chance to start over. Brian stood pacing the room. The silence stretched again, heavier this time. Finally, he stopped and turned to face her. I don't know if I can promise you anything right now, he said. I need time to figure out what I want and what I'm capable of forgiving. This isn't just about you, Samantha. It's about me too. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I understand. Take all the time you need. I hope you'll let me show you that I'm still worth it. Brian looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he nodded. We'll see, he said, his voice soft but firm. But for now, I need space. Samantha swallowed the lump in her throat and stood as well. Okay, she said. I'll wait as long as it takes. Brian turned to leave, but as he reached the door, he paused. Without looking back, he said, I hope you mean that, because this won't be easy for either of us. The door closed behind him, and Samantha sank back onto the couch, feeling both relieved and devastated. She had been given a chance, a fragile, tentative chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. As for Brian, he walked to his car feeling lighter, but no less uncertain. He wasn't sure if he could ever trust Samantha again, but he knew he owed it to himself to figure out the answer. Whatever came next, he would face it on his terms.